So let me start by what I'm going to do. I'm going to introduce the moderator of the panel. We are extremely grateful that we really have world-class faculty across the university and beyond to talk about this topic. So I will start by introducing the moderator, which is Deborah Schrag. Deborah is called Deb and a friend and colleague, but she's importantly a professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. She's the chief of the Division of Population Sciences, Medical Oncology at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Deb, in addition to understanding data science very well, when she has some free time, she's a clinician with long-standing focus on gastrointestinal cancer and particularly colorectal cancer. Just to give you one example of the gazillion things she does, she's currently the principal investigator of the PROSPECT trial, which is a National Cancer Institute phase 3 clinical trial in locally advanced rectal cancer, to really understand the best treatment for rectal cancer in the context where chemotherapy is not effective. Deborah Schrag, Dr. Schrag, is a leader in the development of systems to integrate patient-reported outcomes into both clinical trials and routine oncology care. She's a fellow of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, an elected member of the Association of American Physicians, and as associate editor of the Journal of American Medical Association. Please join me thanking Deb.
Thank you, Francesca and David. So we're going to switch gears to focus this panel on personalized health. This is a great panel, all working on this problem, but representing different aspects of the problem, different stakeholders, different views. So hopefully this will be a lively discussion. So just by way of introduction, we have Professor Lorin Crawford, a biostatistician and computational biologist from Brown University, really on the basic end of the spectrum, developing methods to interrogate the wealth of omics data to make sense of complex patterns in biology that underlies disease. We have Peter Parks, who's also a computational biologist, who's a professor of bioinformatics at Harvard Medical School, who's really done some of the pioneering work in understanding the molecular underpinnings and genomics that underlie cancer. Turning a little bit away from genomics towards phenotyping or phenomics, we have J.P. Onnela, a professor of biostatistics at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, whose current work really focuses on digital phenotyping and what we can learn from passive data collection from smartphones and other observational methods. We're fortunate to have Katrina Armstrong, who leads the Department of Medicine at MGH and has seen really medicine from every possible angle, both teaching, healthcare delivery, as well as research, and has done some really pioneering work using big data and really focusing on ensuring that we avoid exacerbating chronic problems related to healthcare disparities and inequities as we think about how we use data. And finally, we have Professor Robert Huckman from the Business School, who leads the Healthcare Delivery Science Initiative and that track at the MBA program, and interfaces regularly with people all across the commercial space to think about how we actually realize the vision of precision medicine and actually make good on what is often an idea and a goal more than a reality. So I'm going to start just with a couple of slides and then open it up to what I hope will be a lively discussion. So what is everyone on this panel and many, many investigators across the university, what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to deliver better health care. What's the paradigm that we're trying to retire? It's essentially one-size-fits-all, blunt, crude medicine. And I've put up this slide. It comes from an article from Nature. It's old. It's a little bit hyperbolic. But essentially, of the top 10 drugs that are, in terms of sales, the vast majority of them are given to patients and don't achieve their goals. Whether we're talking about treating patients with schizophrenia, with heartburn, with asthma, we give lots and lots of medicines that just don't work. That causes an incredible amount of waste. And we have lots of data that we don't use, and the goal is really to do a lot better in that regard. So I'm gonna, not getting forward. You wanna just forward me one? Thank you. So this is a traditional survival curve. I'm a cancer doctor, so I'm giving you cancer examples. But this is a typical survival curve from a clinical trial published in the New England Journal of Medicine that shows a survival curve for the most common cancer, advanced lung cancer. And this is pretty dismal. And this is comparing 2 flavors of chemotherapy, basically generic poison given to all patients. And you can see that the better chemotherapy, the chemotherapy that's declared a tremendous victory, that this was front page of the New York Times, 18% of patients did not get worse 1 year later, and the median progression-free survival was 7 months. And this was, at that time, now a decade ago, a breakthrough. So what's the paradigm? Actually, can you advance the next one for me? Thanks. The paradigm is work, and some of this actually work was done by one of Katrina's colleagues, is to perform molecular profiling, to do detailed analysis of all patients and pick out the 8% who express a particular gene, and then give them drugs that are smart drugs or personalized drugs that actually attack that specific mutations. And that achieves much better results. So in this example, that really resulted in doubling progression-free survival to 52%, and progression-free survival, instead of 7 months, 14 months. Is this curing cancer forever? No, but living your typical patient having 14 months to live as opposed to 7 months to live for the most common cancer in the United States is actually tremendous. So this is the paradigm. But how do we get there? How do we get there faster? And how do we integrate the vast reams of data that we're now acquiring, that we now have available? How do we leverage data sciences, techniques, and data streams to achieve progress like this as quickly as possible? So I want to start by asking each of the panelists to spend just a couple of minutes telling us about their areas of research. So if you could just, we'll start with you, Dr. Crawford.
Okay.
About how you're trying to tackle this problem and make medicine more personalized or more precise.
Absolutely. Again, my name is Lorin Crawford. I'm an assistant professor, new one, if you can tell, in the Department of Biostatistics. My lab group is a quantitative group, mixture of statisticians, computational biologists, and applied mathematicians. And we study on the machine learning end, we study on how to develop methods to kind of uncover what's happening in black box machine learning based methods. In the context of personalized medicine, we're really interested in connecting when shape variation is connected to phenotypic or genotypic variation. So let's say that you have a brain tumor that has a certain morphology. There have been studies that have kind of showed that certain morphology is linked to certain genetic or molecular profiles. And so what we try to do is not waste information. So how do we take 3D structures that we know have some kind of underlying or latent process that's generated them, and how do we use these in like regression-based methods, right? How do I represent this 3-dimensional curve in a summary statistic, or this 3-dimensional shape and a summary statistic curve that I can use, maybe encompassing as topological information, as geometric information, as a way to connect you to cellular pathways that are kind of driving you to having cancer or driving you towards some phenomenon like therapeutic resistance.
And Professor Prak? Yeah.
So when I was doing my PhD, I was doing the matrix computations that you saw in this talk. And I decided, of course, not foreseeing what would happen with the Googles and Amazons, I wanted to do something that's more practical for the patient. And so my lab currently focuses on DNA sequencing, especially whole genome sequencing data So when you sequence somebody's DNA, it actually generates about about billion data points. So you got to put that together and try to figure out what the mutations are, and that turns out to be fairly complicated. And so for you to do the right therapy to patient matching, you have to know what's wrong in the DNA, and that in addition to tiny substitutions, there are lots of other mutations that we actually still cannot figure out. So that's what my lab focuses on.
Okay.
So just take one step back from, just think about the big picture. Most of our lives evolve around the environment, our genome, and the phenotype. So what my group is trying to do is we're trying to tackle a problem that's often called the phenotyping problem. The basic idea is that if we think about different types of phenotypes from imaging to transcriptomics, social and behavioral markers have traditionally been very poorly characterized. And that's because we have tended to rely either on surveys, which are subjective, taken by individual patients, or we've relied on tests which have been carried out by clinicians, and they tend to vary from person to person. And the problem with both of these categories is that the end result tends to be subjective. It tends to be cross-sectional rather than longitudinal, and there are other issues there as well. So our 2 cents towards solving this problem has been to define a concept that we call digital phenotyping. And the idea is to collect essentially continuously passive data from personal digital devices, in particular smartphones. And our goal in this area is to construct new digital markers for social and behavioral and cognitive phenotypes. So as part of our work in this area, we've built a platform which runs on AWS that collects the data. Our main focus is on developing methods in this area. We collect about 1 billion data points per subject per month. And our third area is to run actual studies, primarily in neurology and in mental health, and try to make sense of these, try to put these new concepts into use.
I have to say, the best thing is if you could predict what my kids are going to do, I could use that. So I think that would actually be better in many ways. So I think as Deb said, so my name is Katrina Armstrong. I am an investigator. I'm an epidemiologist by training, and used to like my data very clean and measured in a way. But the focus of my lab forever has really been on disparities in cancer survival, and particularly in breast cancer. And I would say, I think about it, the biggest places I keep running into data issues, and I think part of the beauty of this initiative is to be able to bridge links to people who are thinking about the methods and people who are trying to understand how to bring data to a problem. And I've probably been more in the former. And so I'll tell you guys, one of the first studies that we know is that it actually is a crazy thing that if you measure how much you all trust each other in this room, if you were to just measure that right now, it has an enormous impact upon your health. And we don't understand that at all. And one of the first grants that I ever did was trying to understand these measures of social trust at a kind of group level, and why on earth should they actually affect health. And it turns out that we measured a whole lot of stuff in surveys. We pulled a lot of stuff from environmental data. We did a lot of stuff. And we ran into a problem where we couldn't actually map people effectively to their environment, right? People were moving all over their environment. I had a static measure of environment at an area level, and I gave up. I said, this is too hard. I can't figure out my exposure measure because people are moving and the data are too complicated. And so that's an example, I think, where we have a clear need, not just to measure on iPhones, but to be able to create new ways to track and to create longitudinal and other ways to think about data. So another example I give is my last example, there's so many I could come up with. But one of my passions recently, as Deb has been saying, has been the kind of challenge of applying the genomic data and all these other different tools to minority populations. And there's so many examples of how we've basically just gone wrong. So we sequence a bunch of Northern Europeans, and then we decide that we're somehow going to take those data. We don't know how to assess whether or not those data are actually valid to use in any other group. And what we discover is that most of the time, we're probably putting both the wrong coefficient on those, we're misunderstanding things about those data. And it's because the universe of data that we're pulling from is fundamentally biased. The best example I give to students of this is the concept, and this may or may not be true, so if this is not true, can you guys not tell anybody? This would actually really hurt me. But I've been told by people who live in the AI world that as Google Translate, and maybe you guys could go in it, actually goes in and tries to translate Turkish into English, that in Turkish, does anybody speak Turkish here? I'm told that there is the pronoun in Turkish is gender-free, that it's, okay, how do you say it? Oh, so close. Oh. And that if Google Translate, if I go into Google Translate right now and I put in "oh cooks," it will push it back to me as "she cooks." And if I go into Google Translate right now and I put in "oh leads," or "oh, I don't know, whatever else, makes money," it will translate it back as "he leads" and "he makes money." Now, Google Translate is not intrinsically sexist. It is living from the available data that it is using. And as we think about precision medicine, I would just like to say it is impossible we can move this forward unless we understand how to deal with the biases in the system of where the data are coming up from. And if you guys could help us do that, it would be a gift not just to precision medicine, but honestly to so many other parts of our country. So that is why I am here.
Well put. Beautifully put.
Thanks for having me here, and this is a great panel to be involved with. And like Katrina, I come to this from a slightly different perspective. I am someone who has done a lot of, I'm trained as an empirical microeconomist who specialized in healthcare-related research. I spent a lot of time dealing with transaction level data for the last 20 years because that's the way the data is in healthcare. It's a discharge, it's a patient record, it's a lab test, whatever it may be. It's one of the beauties of healthcare as a field if you're interested in data generally. My particular interests when it comes to precision medicine are really more about what I might call precision delivery, because historically I've sort of looked from the supply side, not solely from the demand side. Although I will say that I am very interested in bringing the two together, and I'm currently working to move a lot of my work towards how do we appeal to heterogeneous consumer preferences that may have nothing to do with their, or at least not directly to do with their genomic data, but rather just with the fact that they have a particular type of job that they can't afford to miss for healthcare. They have a family situation that causes them to be more attuned to whether or not they have particular support needed to go through a particular surgical procedure versus a non-medical form of treatment. They have a certain aversion or anxiety about infection versus a tendency to want to have pain relief, for example. And those things might push you, in the first case, away from surgery, and in the second case, towards surgery for a particular condition. So I'm kind of curious in how those consumer things work. In terms of my own research, though, I've spent a lot of time, as I said, looking at the supply side, and again, trying to unpack what we had initially might have thought were homogeneous relationships into their kind of more heterogeneous structure. So an example I would give is I've done a study of radiologists and looking at their read times for very basic sorts of radiology reads. We're talking about head CTs, spine CTs, basic MRIs, and one of the things people have said about there was for a time this business model toward teleradiology where we would take all of these quote unquote commodity procedures or reads and outsource them to radiologists who were perhaps in other places. And for various reasons, it hasn't taken off quite as well as some might like. But one of the things in our research that we realized is there's another reason why it might not take off, which is that to assume that somebody who reads a head CT coming out of Mass General is going to be as effective reading that CT with volume as they would be if they were reading some CTs coming from Mass General and some coming from the Leahy Clinic and some coming from UCSF. It turns out that actually the organization that was originating these studies was very important to the effectiveness of the radiologist in reading them. That is, there's actually some familiarity between a radiologist and the place where that study originated, which to us was, it sort of suggested that these outsourced models may have some real challenges if our assumption is, well, all we're doing is outsourcing commodity activity. There's something about those human connections, even in these non-human things, that really matter on the supply side, and I can only think it's even greater when we start to factor in patient preference. So.
So I want to ask each of you really the same question, which is when you think, and not over the next 20 years when we're surrounded by robots and AIs, but really over, let's say, the next 5 years, what do you see as the most impactful opportunities to harness data and data science to make healthcare and healthcare delivery more personalized? So maybe we'll go backwards. Maybe we'll
I have a huge wish on this, which is that we could actually come up with good data about refined patient preferences. So we have got great, and I think we really do have great sources of electronic medical record data, and I'm hoping Katrina would agree with me. I mean, we've had kind of a bump up in that in recent years. We're on the early stages of getting very good genomic data on larger and larger populations. If we were allowed through IRBs and privacy regulators to use data about what we purchase, then we have excellent data about those things. The thing we don't necessarily have clear data about yet is what does someone want to get out of their healthcare? We could potentially try to build that from all of these other sources. But I think that is one of the as someone who's a patient, not a provider, it is one of the most important things that I think we are currently lacking in healthcare, which is a sense of what kind of patient are you? Are you somebody who wants, pain to go from an 8 to a 0 by any means necessary? Or are you someone who wants pain to go from an 8 to a 4 if you're told that you can do it with very non-invasive and less invasive approaches? So getting that sense of what a consumer wants, I think, would be a great source of data.
Yeah, I'm going to take a step back and go back to the basic science side. I think it'd be awesome if we could get like longitudinal or like time series based data in genomics. That'd be so cool. So I think sequencing efforts have started to explode, right? So as the cost to sequence a genome decreases, you can take more granular time points and as people's genomic data, imaging, whatever, phenotyping, whatever the case might be. And there are these really cool models in time series for finance where you can kind of study trends over time. And so if you take those same ideals and you put in genomics, what we really want to model is like an evolutionary process, right? But because sequencing is so expensive, or unless you work at the Broad, everywhere else, for everyone else, it's so expensive for the rest of us to actually get a really clear picture of these evolutionary time points. And so we're missing all this information as you just take cancer, for example. If you go from the initial time point when you've been diagnosed, you get this acute response, and then you get resistance, right? And you're missing all of these cool evolutionary questions right in the middle, right? And so in the next 10 years, as this cost goes down, we're going to be able to get these finer and finer time points. And so we're going to be able to track like resistance mechanisms over time and when those switches happen. And so I think over the next couple of years, like that's going to be a cool connection. And then if you put that on top of that, if you look at the longitudinal studies with imaging, now you give all these kind of omics sources of information that kind of link all these processes together and get a really clear picture, not only on populations as a whole, but like subpopulations and actually individuals. So
maybe we'll go to you next, Peter, sticking with the basic. Yeah.
Sure. Well, certainly there's a lot of clinical data out there, but if you actually talk to people that are analyzing clinical data, they spend probably 80% of their time actually cleaning the data, right? Because there's so many inconsistencies.
80? How about 99.9?
99.9.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, how many ways are there to spell
Is
a
that
drug
fair?
name?
I think is that fair? Yeah.
And coming from outside to medicine, there are lots of low-hanging fruits if you just have clean, curated data sets. I'll just give you one example. When my wife was pregnant with our first child, I went to see the doctor, and she said, "Oh, your due date is to state." I said, "Oh, that's great. What's the standard error?" Or standard error bar.
Turns out it's about 180 days.
I mean, this is a trivial problem, right? I mean, it's important, right? Because your people make plans
Not
around
a rare
the
condition.
date. Yeah. And she says, I have no idea. I said, if you have the data, you put an undergraduate student there, and we come with an error bar. I mean, you just find somebody with a similar characteristic, right? Race, age, weight, first pregnancy or not. this is a class project if we had the right data set. So before we can talk about introducing complex genomics data, which I love to do, I think having such a data set would enable lots of these little things.
So lack of access to clinical data or to clean clinical data.
That's
sounds
right.
Like
That's right. I mean, to me, just to ask that question, the amount of effort that I have to put in to get data from multiple sources and clean it would be prohibitive for me. Right? And just
I can get you this.
excellent.
But don't tell anybody that we're making it up. It's a deal.
So, am I next?
Yeah.
Great. So I'm pretty far from healthcare delivery because I do most of my work on a blackboard in my office with an actual blackboard other than a whiteboard. So, but thinking about what is it that, for example, our research could contribute, I think I would go back to your point and the idea that currently we don't really measure outcomes in a continuous manner at all. So a really good example, I think, is stroke. If you know somebody who has stroke, then they're treated in the hospital, and they come back twice after the stroke. There's something called, I believe, the modified Rankin scale, which is a scale from 0 to 5, and it's administered once 30 days after stroke, the second time 90 days after stroke. And this is 5 different, it's a scale from 0 to 4 or 0 to 5 or something. And just to give you a sense of how crude that is, one of those answers is that the patient is actually dead, right?
So that's 0.
Hopefully that's 0, yes. And 5 is the patient is totally fine. So that doesn't leave you a very nuanced way to understand. Now you have 2 points post-stroke, and the variable can be 1, 2, 3, or 4. And so I think that being able to assess or monitor recovery on a person-by-person basis, potentially even to be able to come up with individualized trajectories of recovery. But I think there's another point to this, which is that we tend to be excited, at least on the basic science side, we're very excited about data and so on, but I've never met a physician who would say, I would love to have more data on my dashboard. And I think what most physicians would actually like, what I would like my physician to do, is to spend more time with me and less time at the computer. So I think that some type of decision support systems could be well within the next 5 or 10 years reach that could then increase that patient-physician interaction time and could hopefully lead to better healthcare. I have no idea what he does behind his computer. I think he's taking notes, but he's definitely doing something. So I would like him to be more, the physician to have more time to spend with the patient.
So Katrina's next, and Katrina is responsible for educating, or the next generation of clinicians. So Katrina,
they're usually on ESPN, just so you know.
Okay.
So I guess, Katrina, to what percentage of clinical encounters, let's say in primary care right now, do you think are informed by clinical decision support?
Oh, a ton.
Or actually using algorithms?
Oh, a ton. I mean, we use way more of this than you guys may. There's a ton going on. I think the problem, if I could pick my 2 things for 5 years or 10 years or whatever, and I know I just made 2, not 1, but let's just go with it. The first is I think that there's a mismatch between, and I'll use Rob's terms, supply and demand in terms of the problems that need to be solved and the people thinking about how to solve the problems. I mean, I've had streams of people from like Google and they all think that there's money and then their data. But we haven't figured out the problems that the provider is dealing with or the patient is dealing with. And maybe it really is, like, how likely is that to be my due date and as I get closer to it? One of the greatest examples is, do your kids have the snow day calculator? How many people have kids? Do you guys know about this snow day calculator? It is like a brilliant use of data where basically every kid in Boston looks up the probability based upon very easily available data. I don't know where that guy is, but if he's not in one of your grad schools, you should find him and get him. And like, it's a universally problem-solving thing of like, how likely is my school to be closed tomorrow? And so I would say the first thing we need to do is to figure out how to get, to your point and your point, the actual tools to fit the needs. And so we use a ton of it, but a ton is developed that actually is not a pain point, does not need innovation, and is not a space that is going to be taken up. I guess the other thing I would just say to your guys' points about the data is that I think we're actually going to go through 5 years of slight discouragement, let's just say, in big data. Because what it turns out is that a lot of the labels we've been putting on things like stroke or heart attack or Crohn's disease or cancer probably are not going to match the patterns that we see in the big data. And that when we actually understand the fundamental biology, the fundamental course of that illness, we understand these exposomes, or we understand what's going on, all those things that you tried to clean up in your data set are probably wrong, or at least a huge amount of misclassification. Does that make sense? So I think for the next 5 years, actually, we got to have a huge amount of tolerance for understanding that we're going to have to rebuild the language you're using to study and understand health and disease. And I think that's critical for us to move forward. So as you start to see the stuff to come out, I would just be really careful about using labels that are just words we made up 50 years ago when we didn't have the data, and see that as an opportunity, not as like a bummer that you're like, R squared doesn't work, right? It's an opportunity for us to use data to redefine health and disease. So those are two very different issues. One is about make the right tools. The second is deal with the fact that we're going to hit chaos before we hit clarity in a big way, I think.
So I want to press you on getting the right tools and deciding when the tools are ready to be implemented or adopted in the clinic or at the bedside, or as your clinician is sitting there trying to divide their attention between making eye contact and looking at you, which is what you want, and the box that has the algorithms, or pressing the buttons to run the algorithms in real time. How do we use data science methods, and this is really for everyone, how do we use data science methods to ensure that algorithms have acceptable levels of validity and reliability? Because we're not talking, I mean, snow days is great, but if the snow day algorithm is wrong.
My kid is really sad.
They're like, sad.
Way more sad than most of the things that I predict about.
Yes. But giving patients drugs that don't work, or there's a lot in healthcare where there's higher stakes than planning for a due date or a snow day, and the consequences of being wrong in extreme cases can be fatal or put people in the hospital. So how do we think about harnessing the data science techniques to know when is?
Well, actually, I was just thinking the last time I was in this room, I gave a lecture on uncertainty. And I do think we have to recognize that there is no, I don't know, maybe you guys are going to make the world magic and we're going to know for sure exactly what's going to happen. But I think we have to be willing to recognize that there's uncertainty in all clinical decision making that we make. And there's honestly I don't think that's going to change. And in fact, usually where I go with that is that when physics thought they were going to solve all uncertainty is when quantum mechanics happened, right? So biology is no different. There is going to be fundamental uncertainty I don't think we're going to cover. I'm going to push back on you, Deb. I think we ask way too much of our tools. I think I'm willing to go on Google and look stuff up while I'm seeing a patient and decide how to use that in that thing. And I think the issue isn't that the tool has to be right. I think the issue is how do we put that tool in the broad spectrum, and I think to your point, Rob, of what we know about the patient, what we know about other things. I think we should have a much more continuous quality improvement learning system for our tools, but I think we should be way less hesitant to start using something that we think can actually add a modicum of discrimination in the best possible way of using that word to how we make clinical decisions. And we use that in clinical medicine all the time.
Yeah, we use it.
We just don't calculate in our, a net reclassification index for it. We just do it. So I guess I would argue that I would not hold us to a high standard. I would start using these tools and measuring outcomes. That probably isn't what I was supposed to say.
Well, I think another thing that one has to consider is how the data are interpreted, because most physicians do not understand probabilities, right?
Nobody does actually.
Right?
Patients either.
Right. So, I think there's a level of mistakes that can be made in making hypotheses about different diseases, because there's so much data out there, and it's actually very easy to make mistakes. And I see it all the time. People are rushing to publish the findings. There are lots and lots of spurious correlations that are all over the literature. And so, you have to, I don't know if there's a way to sort of clean that up, but my lab has published many papers on major findings that turn out to be totally wrong.
Right.
And so I think that there has to be some safeguard at that level, and then of course to have people understand what the probabilities are in interpreting the results.
I think. I think it's great. So some people were asking about interpretability of machine learning. I think machine learning is a great tool because you're able to leverage nonlinearities in these like really scalable ways, right? So mathematically, data science is interesting to me because we've kind of like curved out pure math as being like you're not real data science, but there are these interesting theorems that kind of give you these nice theoretical guarantees and like probability measures in like measure theory and topology, and these nice theorems that give you these nice properties that we've kind of like edged out as not being applicable. It's like what we do every day. And I think there's a nice sweep of new investigators that are trying to take these theorems and kind of use them to more everyday practical usage that we use in our models today, right? And I think for like interpretability, I know some people say that there's a huge argument in deep learning right now. Is it necessary? And no, it's not always necessary. But in our context, it is, right? There's a consequence for not knowing when something is going to perform well monotonically, right? Like there's a huge consequence for that. And I think incorporating more of like pure math in our everyday educational systems is going to be key there.
The comment that I was going to make that we can think about methods a lot, but there's also saying garbage in, garbage out. So one of the things that we really try to focus on is how do we get really high quality data? Because if you have terrible data, there's no learning deep enough in the world that's going to save you from that. Especially then if you have mislabeled cases like you have. I think mental health is a great example of this. DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and essentially it's an expert opinion on this is this illness, this is that illness, and so on. You referred to quantum mechanics. So my PhD was in physics. I'm a network scientist by training. And in 1890, people used to think that everything was discovered in physics. Yeah. And Maxwell famously said something, I forget the exact phrasing, that the pleasure of the labor of measurement is not only to be able to get more precise results, but to discover new scientific phenomena. And that's, of course, what took us from classical mechanics to quantum mechanics. So I think that the idea that we could measure more, but also we really have to care about the quality of the data that we're getting. Maybe that's a way how we can then get better labels, and then we can do our favorite flavor of deep learning. And that's my 2 cents on that.
So I'm going to shortly give you guys a chance to ask questions of the panelists, but before that, one more question. So you've spoken about data opportunities. So imagine that you have the chance to create a dream data set. A lot of the opportunities, I think, in data science to personalize healthcare involve integrating or linking streams of data that aren't currently linked. If you could, ignoring the privacy and the sharing issues, if you could link data sets or integrate streams of data to solve problems, the sky's the limit, money's no object, privacy's no object, what would you do?
Well, I can take a crack because I've thought about this a lot, which is what I could do. And again, the key constraint you're lifting is no privacy concerns, because it's the thing that kills everything. Either the actual privacy concern or the concern that we're going to violate the thing that's supposed to protect privacy. We don't quite understand that law and what it involves and not. I would say I think there are three things. If I have three data sets, with respect to individual consumers and making their healthcare better, individual patients, I would say I want to know something about what or who they are. I mean, literally at the most basic level, so thinking about genomic data about that patient. I'd like to know what the system has done to them, that is the healthcare system, so that would be linking this with EMR data. That would be comprehensive. I don't need the claims data from the insurer. If I've got pretty good EMR data and I have some genomic data, I feel pretty good with. The third thing that we don't have, and I maybe, well, we have it, but we haven't yet been able to link it, is I just basically need to know data about what you do, everything else. And so this is to JP's, I mean, I'm sure what JP's work is all about, which is, if you told me you could take, the partner's EMR, linking it with their genomic data, which they're trying to collect through their biobank, and then you could pair up with CVS or Amazon or whatever it may be, so that I just know basically what people are buying. It tells me a lot about what they're doing. I could put it with their Fitbit data instead, but something that just tells me about, has Rob's wrist moved in the last 14 hours? Right, that tells me a lot, actually. And then also, by the way, what has he bought? That would tell me a little bit too. What has he signed up for? So those would be the three. But.
Say when I find out what my husband has done on Amazon over the last 12 hours, it doesn't make my life better.
No. But it would help me provide health care to him potentially. And that's all I really care about right now.
I'm like, we bought what?
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone else want to tackle one?
I mean, I would do something similar. I would go to Framingham. I would instrument 50,000 people, digitally phenotype them for 5 years. I would genotype them. And how many data sources do I get to have?
You get 3. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by digitally phenotype them?
So what that would mean in our setting is that everyone would install, whether they have an iPhone or an Android, they would install that app on their phone, and that's the only point of contact. So it's like 1 minute or 2 minutes of their life. And then it just sits there, collects about 1 billion data points per person per month. And then I think a benefit of that would be, and of course I'm totally biased, but often we start collecting data once something has happened. So somebody already has developed PTSD or something else. We often don't have the pre-data. So I think that with smartphones, I used to give these kinds of talks by asking, like the previous speaker, actually was David, I think, asked, how many of you have ordered something from Amazon? And I used to ask people, how many of you have a smartphone? But there's no point in asking because everybody already has this technology, right? But the point is that we have, the technology is ubiquitous.
Well, I will push back on you a little bit there. Actually, not all of our patients do.
That's right.
It's getting closer, but we do.
92% of US adults.
Large segments of the globe that don't.
Yeah. So that's
who we care about.
Yeah.
I want to push a little bit back on this point. There's always been, when you introduce a new technology, there are always people who have it and people who don't have it. Smartphones are the fastest spreading technology our species has introduced. In 10 years, imagine, we've gone in this country from 0 to 89, 91%, depends on whom you trust. By 2023, end of 2023, globally, we're going to have 6.3 billion smartphone subscriptions on the planet. I don't know of any technology that goes from 0 to 75% coverage in 12 or 13 years. I mean, maybe there is something, and so there is a divide.
I think my kids have several of those.
Yes.
More than their share.
Your kids will be excluded from this number.
No.
But the idea is that there's always a divide, and people are often quick to point this out. But not everybody has access to an fMRI scanner. Not everybody has access to a physician. I mean, we happen to be in Cambridge, Massachusetts, so it's not too hard to find doctors here. But I think that this technology is pretty prevalent, and that to me is the biggest reason to be optimistic about this stuff. That actually technology is already out there. We don't have to reinvent it. That's my 2 cents.
Well, in terms of genomic data, the amount of work that you have to do to get published data, from a paper, is quite a bit, right? And so I will actually, to access, the new data from a big paper, I have to spend a lot of time filling application, get somebody at the institution to sign off on it. I have to do a yearly report on everything that I've done with that data. This is too much, and I will actually not analyze a lot of data because of the paperwork that's needed. And so if there is a way to, facilitate process, I think that would make tremendous opportunities for people. I mean, if you are a smart graduate student, you want to look at cancer data to test your theory, impossible, because you will not have access to the resources to do the paperwork, and that's unfortunate.
So you think a lot about the exposome, right? And you mentioned the example of where people live, what zip code they're born in is not the zip code that they're educated in, and even zip code is a proxy for lots of other things. But sort of, what do we need to do? What are the important data streams?
Well, I mean, I was actually thinking, listening to this, and I'm all in on smartphones, but one of the programs that we've been working on over the last 3 years is actually to try to deliver even a modicum of healthcare to the Sioux tribes in western South Dakota. And they don't even have, most of them don't have a flip phone. There is no internet. And I do worry about the people we're leaving behind, just to be clear, both because of the bias in the data and because inequality across so many parts of our country has grown so unbelievably dramatically. So if I had a wish for data, it really would be that we somehow see data as a social good, and that there is a way that we don't allow people to be left behind in this revolution. And so I hear you about the numbers, but it's not an unbiased sample of who doesn't have a smartphone, let me tell you. And we need to think about that, both in terms of how we're developing tools and understanding biology, and about how we're going to actually use this technology to improve society in whatever ways that we want to do that. So that would be my wish, is you can have whatever data you want, but I don't want you to forget about certain groups who are out there and need help just as much or more than anybody else. But what was your question? That was not your question. I've learned that.
That's a great answer.
Excellent.
The question was, you get to integrate or link streams of data that...
Oh, I just like their data.
Yeah.
I think they're really good at that. I'd link their data. I like the longitudinal plan, but
Right.
I think longitudinal data is a huge amount of what, and the point that we can't even access the data we have, I think that's totally
I was gonna say, I like the not forgetting out groups. We've done a great job of genotyping Europeans, and everything we know about diseases, from GWAS at least, is particularly everything we know about certain traits and complex traits are all based on Europeans, and we completely forgot about the rest of the globe. Yeah, right. And so now all of a sudden it's we need to do multi-ethnic things because Black people exist and because other people exist. And so I totally agree with that. I would love to have that kind of data, but I think spreading it to those groups would be super important.
I think related to this question of getting access to these different sources, there is a piece too that exists in a different dimension of data access, which is the sharing of data. Because back to the earlier discussion of, there's value in their data, right? So people have this sense of, well, if the Googles and Amazons and Facebooks of the world have the ability to mine this amazing set of data that they're accumulating, well, then I, as a provider at Academic Medical Center A, I'm starting to work on patients with lung cancer, not necessarily, realizing that might be, 100 different variants of lung cancer. But I'm building up my own scale, and I'm going to create data, that's going to have value too, either academically or perhaps for commercial purposes or whatever. And you've got a lot of these subscale data collection efforts that are building up, which is great, but are not combining because everyone's thinking about, well, where's the, either the proprietary academic value or financial value in it for me to kind of make good on these data. And it's jamming up what, as healthcare is becoming more and more precise and needing more and more precise answers, people are collecting data that's still subscale and not coming together to really be able to do that.
So I actually think, I know in my own organization, we are incredibly challenged by thinking about what the right business models are for exchanging data. So patients come to us and we now think of our data assets as among the most important that the institution has. And we want, across Partners Healthcare, I work at Dana-Farber, we want to collect more and more information from our patients to begin with, not only from the point when we start to see them when they develop cancer, but what happened to them before, what they were exposed to, who they're related to. Collecting all this information is actually resource intensive because we're not able to do it yet through everyone's smartphones. But then once we have it, what is, how do we share that? Do we put that out and share that with companies for free to create knowledge? Or, pharmaceutical companies want access to that data. Many, many firms, all the AI firms want access to that data. How do we sort of engender trust with our patients who've essentially donated and given us that data, hoping that we're gonna cure cancer, cure disease? They've given it to us with a lot of trust, but we now have to figure out sort of the right models for data sharing and data exchange. And I think the entire field is really, we're quite stuck on a lot of those issues. So the business models, I think, are really critical. I don't know if
I would say, yeah, it'd be interesting to see what happens in the wake of what happened at Memorial Sloan Kettering. I think there's a fairly strong belief when I sit in these rooms now that the data in the end are the patients. And if we try to commoditize and make profit off of those data at the healthcare system level, that we are going awry. So I would say that my hope is that as a society we get to that, whether it's genomic data, healthcare data, to recognize that the data belongs to the people whose data it actually is. That doesn't mean that in our society we won't try really hard to figure out how to make money off of it, but my hope is that we come to a common understanding. And then to your point, the biggest issue is the best opportunity may come from linking those data to somebody from a completely different field or a completely different way of thinking, who right now doesn't even know what form to fill out, let alone have somebody who can fill out it for them. That was not said correctly, but you know what I meant to say. So Deb, I really hope that we don't decide to commoditize and sell patient data. I think that would be not the best thing for academic medicine over the next decades to come.
any thoughts?
Well, I have one thing on this question, because we do have a lot of our true assets. So I think of, I recently wrote a case on Intermountain Healthcare's movement into precision medicine. And the question at the end of the case was they have 5 million samples essentially in a basement that have been taken from patients for whom they have electronic medical record data. Now, it's not 5 million different patients, but it's 5 million samples. It's going to be a lot of patients. And I think about all these efforts to create 1 million lives at the national level, that or 1 million lives in the VA, and I'm sitting here thinking, they probably got 1 million lives sitting right there, and they've got the EMR data already linked to it. And now the question becomes, how can they use it? And how can Intermountain benefit from it? Does it become a utility? I mean, maybe there's not commercial value, but could there be utility value in this for researchers writ large? Because to walk away from that is just something to me that I understand every privacy regulation there, and I get it, because chances are someone in this room has their data in that repository possibly. But how do we, I think the key is that maybe you use the term business model. Maybe the question is, what is the sharing model, that we think about?
Yep. Okay, so let's turn it open to the group to get some questions for the panelists. So, yeah. Okay, sorry.
My watch?
Back.
Thank you. I'm an emergency physician, and I wanted to answer JP's questions about what doctors do behind the computer. They generate a lot of really bad quality data. And so this question is directed to Dr. Armstrong. There is over-reliance on EMR data, and there is a very large crowd of people and money that is dedicated to the promise that within 5 to 10 years they will help physicians think better. And the way they're going to feed those algorithms are by looking at our EMRs. How do we as clinicians convey effectively, A, what you said, the pain points are different and you're not solving those, but B, that how doctors think is not captured on American billing instruments / EMRs at all. And this is hugely problematic.
I think, so first of all, it's a great question. I don't have an answer to it. I guess I will say there's a couple, and I don't know who's working on this in the audience, but I think there was a moment of time in the way we talked about clinical data that we've lost, where we really truly understood in some ways that what we were doing was trying to capture actual data variables and measures, if we want to think about it in a true kind of almost physics way. And then we were going to aggregate them ever so often into little stories. Does that make sense? And then ever so often a note might be generated from moments of data or pieces of insight or somehow. In that model, you could imagine that there's a part of the story that is told that is a narrative of decision making. We've actually tried that for one of our house staff services to create a part of the EPIC chart that is actually passed on from only for certain patients where they're really complicated, that is actually a narrative in a free text kind of James Joycean almost model, right? So how you then go back with the NLP or whatever and understand the thought process. But the one thing if I've asked them to do is to don't use labels that don't make sense to you. Does that make sense? So that the problem is physicians use jargon. They don't show that when they talk. So my hope is if we were going to solve that is I think the note should only come from the fact, and this may mean nothing to people who don't do medicine, but we generate all these notes all the time, and they're just repetitive, and they're garbage, and they mean nothing. The note should reflect some true sense of the phenotype that is measured at different moments, and then aggregated into a note. Does that make sense? Not the note then driving that. And then we should be documenting in a different way how we are continually learning about that patient. And that learning documentation, I have no idea how to do, but if you could get it, I think it would be hugely helpful for the educational point that Deb made from birth. Because my biggest job is to teach people how to think. It's not how to document. And those things are often very different.
Can I make a quick question?
Yeah.
So I wonder, I'm just curious about this. I wonder if somebody has done a study where the same patient goes to see 20 different physicians, 20 different notes are created, and then somebody looks at how consistent are these 20 different notes and repeat this a few number of times.
The problem right now is I can tell you if we're all on Epic, it's the exact same note because they just cut and paste everything.
Okay, so it's...
what the point is that we've lost a huge amount of the data that actually we're going to need to make sense of health and healthcare by how we're currently doing electronic records. I mean, I don't know how many people want to bet that Amazon's going to fix this in this audience, but there is a betting game right now that there will be a true disruption in this and get back to how we should be thinking in terms of the data that you want or other people want to collect. We just put $5 billion into Epic, so I will have to say I will drink a large bottle of wine if we then get rid of it and go with Amazon, but it may be what happens.
So one last question, I see Emily there.
Yep.
Brief, super brief.
We'll continue this over lunch.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Eating is good.
Thank you for an absolutely fascinating panel. So 90% of the world's data is trapped in unstructured data formats. And we have an explosion of cognitive AI, NLP, other technologies that can start to help us read all of those reams of pictures, voice, paper, et cetera, at very high levels of accuracy. And finally, I think some of you have already pointed out the power in potentially marrying social determinants of health, in addition to the fantastic work we've done historically in the clinical arena to help start to understand what's driving outcomes or to even be predictive. So my question for you is, in addition to the great progress that you have shared today, how do you see these sorts of developments potentially being incorporated in your approaches and in your research and with patients going forward?
Well, I'll say that everything you hit on, I'm coming back to is Amazon going to be the EMR for Katrina's hospital? I'm not sure it's Amazon, but based on what David said about how good they are at delivering physical good and how good they seem to be with handling information and everything, let's call it a company like Amazon that has done investments like Amazon. I'm not sure there is another one. But I think even when you get to social determinants of health, what are the social determinants of health? Access to food security, right? A secure source of food, access to transportation, probably access to broadband, which is arguably more important than probably access to electricity, although I think you need one for the other. So I have a feeling that that their ability to play in this space is going to be even broader than just simply throwing Epic out, which is I think a real possibility too. So.
Well, so I want to thank the panelists and thank everyone, and we'll continue over lunch. Thank you.